Okay, hi everyone. So we're going to move on into chapter 2. So hopefully chapter 1 went pretty smoothly for most everyone. I think it did from at least this go around. Seems like everyone did a good job learning the concepts in chapter 1. Now, we said JavaScript is going to start to be difficult, and then you started with chapter 1, and for a lot of people, JavaScript was not difficult in chapter 1. So let's take that same intensity in chapter 1 and apply it here in chapter 2, and make sure that we don't ease off the gas here, because it is a more difficult chapter. Okay, so just starting with that, realize that it's going to require the same amount of effort, if not more. Okay, so really chapter 2, a lot of dealing with functions, and so we're going to introduce this idea of a function and what's the purpose of that. We're going to use some different expressions, and so we're going to do some math in JavaScript, right? We're going to have some math going on inside of our expressions. And anytime we do math, just like in our math class, we have an order of operations. Same thing here. Yes. Yep. So back in chapter 1, we defined what a method was. And we defined a method as a procedure associated with an object, like the WriteLine method. WriteLine is a method associated with the document object. Okay, a function is essentially the same thing, but it's not associated with an object. So what a function really is just a block of code that you give a name. So and when I say a block of code, it's just a little bit of code, you give it a name. The whole benefit, the whole reason why, what's the benefit of writing a function is for code reusability. If you write a function one time, then you could simply just call that function as many times as you need it. Okay, you don't have to write the same code multiple times. You write the code in a function, and then you use that function as many times as you need it. So functions are executed as a single unit. You call the function, it executes that block of code. Again, the terminology is always a little, depending on the language, they call it a function, they call it a method, they call it a procedure. There's different names for it, but they're basically the same thing. You can see here it's not associated with an object. And our functions are written within a script tag. So it is JavaScript. Just like everything all the JavaScript we've written so far, it's been in a script tag, or it's been on an event handler, like an OnClick. I think a lot of you did the hands-on test. You used an OnClick event handler. So you're either writing JavaScript OnClick at this point, or you're writing it in the script tag. These functions are going to be within the script tag. There's really two types of functions, and it's as simple as this. If you give a function a name, right, you could call it by its name. But if you just have a block of code that doesn't have a name, then they call that an anonymous function. Okay, and essentially that's not reusable. It's just going to run once. Wherever it's located in the code, that's where it runs. So you see that there on the slide. So let's write a function, and I'll open up my brackets, and we'll do a very simple function, just kind of functions 101, of course. And you can see the syntax here. We have the keyword function, and then the name of the function. And then in the parentheses are a special type of variable called parameters. But realize parameters are just variables. Okay? So if you know what a variable is, you know what a parameter is. I'm going to write a function without any parameters. Parameters are optional. You could have none, you could have one, you could have many. So I'm just going to write a function hello. And I'll do a window.alert. hello class. This isn't really our first program, so we're not doing hello world, we'll do hello class. Input type of button. Value is click me. On click, now we call our function hello. Should be pretty straightforward. We wrote our function inside of the script. When the page loads, it loaded the script, and then that function just sits there waiting to be called. When the user clicks the button, it should call our function, and an alert dialog box should pop up saying hello class. Voila. Okay. Functions in their most basic form. Now, it gets interesting here when you have parameters. Parameters are variables, and ultimately variables just hold data. So parameters are going to hold data. For example here, in this method called calculate volume, they have 3 parameters: length, width, and height. Okay. Now here's something to notice. These are declaring parameters, right? You're defining the parameters here, the names of your variables. So inside of our function, you might think var, we're just going to call our parameter number. You might think, because you're declaring to put the keyword var, that's not correct. Our parameters, you simply just put the name of the parameter here. Okay? Now, if I pop open the slide, there's 2 important things going on here before I move forward. There's 2 important things that I've coded on the screen. The first thing is creating the function. Okay? And the second thing happens on this line, and that line calls the function. So that's terminology. And matter of fact, a better word would be declaring the function. We declare the function and we call the function. So those are the 2 important steps. When we declare the function, that's when we declare our parameters. And when we call the function, that's when we need to pass a value into them. For example, I might pass the number 7. Okay? And what I'll do on my window.alert, I'll say hello class plus number. And let's just see what the output of that is. Right? So, and then I'll explain how it works. So it says hello class 7.
Are you giving the value to the function, to the number? That 7 is the value?
Yes. So here's what happens. 7 is the value that gets passed into the variable number. So number equals 7 at this point. Does everyone see how that works? Again, we're calling the function hello. We're passing it the value of 7. So essentially, we're assigning the number variable equal to 7. Then I say hello class plus whatever number. Obviously, if I change this number, it'll say hello class 5. And you probably saw I added the space in there to get the space between the word class and the number 5. Now, before I answer any questions, some people are saying, well, hey, I put I put the individual quotes in there. That would make the number 5 a string. Let me just see what would happen if I took the quotes out. Okay? Let's see if this works any differently. Okay, right now you can't see a difference. Okay, there is a difference between putting quotes in there and not. But right now we're just gonna leave that for something to come. Okay, and how I can yeah, I don't want to jump too far ahead. Okay, let me pause the recording here and ask a question. So, a question came up. I paused because I had a lot of hands coming up, and one of the questions was, right now everything is hard coded. You know, whatever I hard code into here, the number 9 gets passed into, what's this variable called? This is called our parameter. So the value gets passed into our parameter, and the parameter gets put inside of the dialog box. But what if we had a text box and we wanted the user to tell us their age? And then in our window alert, we'll say, you are your age, right? So let's go ahead and create a little form, just so that way we're being correct here. And let's have a text box with an ID of text age. And I'll add a label around this. It simply says age. So how could I get the value of the text box to be stored in, instead of calling this number, I'll just change this. These parameters can have whatever names, variables can have whatever name you want. I'm going to call this age. It's the age variable, the age parameter. So how would I get the value out of the text box? I'm obviously not coding 9 in here.
You made it equal to whatever they put input.
How do you do that?
I know how to do this. I did.
Yep. Yeah, yep. So what does that method belong to?
Get a
Document dot
get element by ID.
Get element by ID. And what's the ID? Text age dot value. Okay, so it gets the value of the text box and passes that value into the variable age, and then pops that up in a window.alert. See if it works. Hopefully I'm not forgetting anything, although I wouldn't be surprised. I did not leave the 9 in there. I didn't save it. I didn't save it. My program's lying to me. Okay. So now, whatever I type in. All right. Cool. We ready to do some math? Let's get back to the PowerPoint before we go. I'm getting a little far ahead of myself. Does anyone have questions about this? Step by step, right? Baby steps. One step after another. All right. Let's take another baby step. And I'll get back to the PowerPoint here. Let's have another for your gender. I'll have another text box for your gender. And this will be called text gender. Okay. Now we have multiple parameters. Again, parameters are just variables. Okay. So now it'll say you are your gender and so many years old. Okay. So now this is called a literal string. Okay. Notice the strings are in quotes. It's called a literal string because every time the program runs, it's literally the same thing. Okay. So when you have hard-coded values into your program, they're called literals. This is a literal string. This will say you are male or female, followed by a space. Don't forget your plus here. Then it'll say your age. So it'll say you are male. And I'll say and 50 years old. Okay. Now notice the literal strings are in quotes. The variables are not in quotes. Again, we have a literal string. It's in quotes. The variables are not in quotes. Literal string in quotes. Variables not. Okay. Now, anyone see a problem? Okay, so this is our function declaration that has two parameters. Look at our function call. How many values are we passing it? Just one. How do you think we can pass it to?
You can either
Semicolon's a good guess, but let's put a comma instead. What am I typing? Document.getElement by ID. We talked about why single quotes are needed in here. Text gender dot value. Yes, thank you. Good catch. Text. Make sure case sensitive. Text gender dot value. Let's launch this. Okay. You are male and 50 years old. Cool. Good stuff. Really nothing too different here in their example. In their function, they did a little bit of math, right? So I can do a little bit of math. I'll take your age. I'll assign it equal to the current value of your age plus 1. All I'm doing here is taking the current value of age and adding 1 to it and reassigning it to the age variable. So the way I read this, when I look at this, this will help. You say the new value of age is equal to the current value of age plus 1. So it's different, right? What's changing here is always what's on the left-hand side of the equal sign. And that's such an important thing. I'm going to write it. The left-hand side of the equal sign is the value that is changing. So the new value of age, because that's changing, equals the current value of age plus 1. All we're doing some math, we're adding 1. So if I type in 50 in the text box, it's going to give me back 51, or at least it should. And let's see if it works how we expect it to. And I might be introducing a problem here, but it's expected. Take a look at that. Yeah, you see what it did? Yeah, I was expecting it. Do you see what it did? It appended the 1. It didn't really add it. It just appended it. Okay? The reason for that is when you when you add strings together, that's what happens. It appends them. Okay? So right now JavaScript is looking at our age variable like it's a string. But it's really a number. Okay? And so there's a method called ParseInt. Okay? And this is the trick to turn age into a number so that instead of appending the 1, it adds the 1. Because age was currently seen as a string. So anytime you have to do math, or at least a lot of times, you run into this problem with JavaScript. It's because JavaScript is considered a loosely typed language. We don't give our variables data types. We just say var and then the variable name. We don't say this is a string or this is a number or this is whatever, a Boolean. You see, now the problem is fixed. Okay? Simply by telling age to parse to an integer. Okay. Okay, let's see how far we got through here, because we've definitely defined functions, we've talked about parameters, we've created functions, and we've called functions. Now here's another term. Okay, and I'll reference it here. Okay? And I'll ask you guys for the 5th time, what are these called? Parameters. Now right now, when we call our function, in here we're passing values. Okay? We're passing data from the HTML into the JavaScript function. Okay? But these have a special name. It's data, these are called arguments. Okay? So it's just another term. Okay? An argument is something that you pass into a function. When it's in the function, it's called the parameter. So when the data is here, they just call it an argument. When the data is here, they call it a parameter. Just terminology. Okay? So when you see the slide and they talk about arguments, that's what it is. These are the variables or the values placed in the function call. Does that make sense? All right. See a bunch of head shaking. All right. And that's what we say. We pass arguments. We pass them from the HTML into the JavaScript function. So we pass arguments into parameters. Good stuff. Now, I've used this JavaScript book since, I don't know, version 1 or 2. This is just, I've always learned from this JavaScript book from the day 1 of when I was learning JavaScript. So what are they on now? The 6th edition? Okay, so I've been using this book for a long time. When I learned JavaScript, and we talked about this in chapter 1, JavaScript is all based around events, and that is users interacting with your web page. Right now on our example, the event is the button click. Okay? And so what you do is you have an event handler, which is your function that runs when the event happens, when the event occurs. The reason I told you for a long time, this top way of handling events, this is what we did in chapter 1. Okay? For a long time, that's what I was used to. Okay? You put the attribute OnClick inside of your HTML. The book will give you reasons. Those reasons are escaping me right now. Why there are better ways of attaching your functions to the events. Because that's what we're doing here. Right here on click, we're calling this function. But there are other ways. So here's another way of attaching an event like OnClick to a function. So I'm going to change our demonstration to do that.
I got a quick question.
So I answered a few questions there, but I wanted to demonstrate essentially different ways of doing the same thing. However, the most common method that we're going to use is the AddEventListener. That's what we're going to get used to in this book. That's what they move forward with, that recommendation of using AddEventListener. But I'll start by this second example. Since we already did the first example, I'll do the second example, and then I'll do the third. So this is, let me pull up my code. And 1 second here. Okay. So I'm going to take the OnClick out. And in my JavaScript, okay, this is setting the function as a property value for an object. Document.getElementById. So what we're targeting, we need to target the button. .onClick equals our function called hello.
You essentially did the same thing, but just flipped it.
Right. And so our button needs an ID of submit. So I'll put the submit here. And okay, and so I paused the video there and I just fast forward here. I added the arguments to our function call. And the reason I paused the video is because, as I said before, this is the method that I'm a little bit less familiar with. So I wasn't sure that it was going to work, but I'll tell you what, let's fire it up, and if I make a mistake, I'll fix it. Okay, right away it runs. You are undefined and not a number of years old. So that's not good. We don't want it to run just right away. Let me pause this here. So here's how we can fix this issue. And what I'm going to do is mimic exactly what the book has. The book does not have any arguments. Okay? So I'm going to take the arguments out. Now, if you don't have any arguments, you don't have any parameters. Just because you don't have any parameters doesn't mean you can't declare normal variables in your function. So I'm going to have a var for your age equal to document.getElementById.
Okay, so parameters are predefined variables, basically.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go ahead and declare my variable age and gender equals That way our functions don't have any parameters. When they don't have any parameters, we don't have to pass them here because that was causing things to break. So I just matched the book a little bit more. And let's see if this works. All right, good. Now we're talking. Age 50, gender male, and it is broken. Cannot set property on click of null.
Is there supposed to be a space in between that OnClick?
Yeah, that shouldn't hurt it. So hello is the name of our function. Do you, no? Here, let me try putting this up at the top. See if placing that here makes a difference. Well, what I'm referencing is this slide right here. This second, I might come back to this, okay? Because this second way of doing it, it doesn't seem to be working. Let me just jump right to the third, and I'll come back to the second one. So the third way, since the second way is not being nice, use the AddEventListener. And this looks a little bit different. The ID is submit.
So you took the function out?
The function's still here.
Oh.
So I'm targeting the element and storing it in a variable. And then submit.AddEventListener. Click. I'm calling the function hello. And that false is for backwards compatibility browsers.
So we think.
I must be doing something. Why don't you guys take a break? I'm going to figure it out while you guys are on break. So, resuming the video here, where we left off, I sent my class on break. They have now returned from break, and I've told them how embarrassed I am by how simple this problem was. And I've even given this advice. I've even given my class this advice, and I didn't follow it myself. And the advice that I've given to my class is to put your script at the bottom of your body. Have I told you that before? Again, they all shake their head yes. And I didn't do it myself. And here's why. And here's why it was breaking. You know, for example, and by the way, this is both. Remember I said there's three ways to tie in the event handlers to the event? The second way broke and the third way broke. This is the solution for both of those problems. Okay? Because this says get element by ID submit. Well, when this is up in the head of the body, the submit button hasn't been downloaded to your browser yet. So literally the JavaScript, I want to say renderer, but the JavaScript interpreter literally says, I don't know what the submit button is because it hasn't been downloaded yet. So by putting the script tag at the bottom, your document downloads from top to bottom. It downloads the form and all of the IDs. Then it can recognize these things. And now when I launch the page, watch it not work. Gender 50, gender male, age 50. Click it, you are male and 51 years old. Okay, so that was the fix to all of life's problems for the last 15 minutes. Okay, good. Problem fixed, problem solved. Moving on
So
in
you
the
did it in 2 different ways, right?
PowerPoints.
So
There were 3 different ways total.
so if I would have done it the first way you did, which was kind of on the homework, no problem, right? No issue.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Now, this is their recommendation. Adding an event listener is the most flexible, which is the third one. Here's the thing, when you add an event listener, you can later remove the event listener. So if at one point you want to hover over something, have something happen, and then later down the lifespan of that page, remove that event listener so you could hover over it and it doesn't cause the event to trigger, that would work. You can also, as this says, specify multiple functions for a single event. So you could have one event like a button click and call 5 different functions. Okay, so the third demonstration that I did, this one right here, right here using AddEventListener, is the recommended method to tying your functions to the events. I've already demonstrated the console, the JavaScript console in Chrome. It's a web console in Firefox, and the console button in IE. All these different versions of these different browsers, they're always changing how this works. But that's the general idea of troubleshooting right now. You want to open up the console and read the error message like I demonstrated and see if it can point you in the right direction. A lot of the times it helps. Some of the times it does not. So I'll even say a lot of the times it doesn't. So there are other troubleshooting techniques that we're going to learn, but for right now, this is it. Our functions can return data, or they don't have to. For example, in my code, function hello, all the JavaScript happens right here. We don't need to write any more script outside of this function. Let me see if I can demonstrate. I'm going to simplify my function. I'm just going to call it, I'll just still call it hello. And I'm going to have it return the number 5. Now, I'm going to go back a step and write the OnClick. Call hello. But now I'm going to write a window.alert, and then inside of the alert, I call the function. So what's going to happen is this value is going to be returned inside of the alert, which is going to pop up on the screen when I click the button. So sometimes all of your scripting can happen inside of the function. Other times functions might need to return a value, and you might ask, well, where does it return it to? Well, it returns it to wherever the function is called. So this is a simple example of having a function return a value. You could return a string. And you could see that. You could return 5 times 5. I have a habit of closing the browser instead of just refreshing the page. Okay, so it's really one of the things about functions that I think makes them tricky is where do you need to execute the JavaScript? You know, for example, one of the first things I showed you guys was how to declare parameters, right? Like I had an age and a name. And then in our function call, I passed the values here. I had the value of one text box and I had the value of another text box. And then I passed them into age and name. And that's one way that it can work, right? I showed you guys that. But then I took that out and I said, you know what? I said, if you want to, you have the flexibility. Let's just call hello. Let's just call hello, and then inside of hello, instead of having parameters, we got our normal variables. Age equals document dot get element by ID text age dot value, right? And so instead of passing the value as an argument, I just read the value and store it in a variable inside of the function. Two ways of essentially doing the same thing, right? It's just, does your function have parameters? If your function has parameters, you have to pass it arguments. And so, you know, so as far as calling your functions, does it have parameters? Does it not have parameters? Same thing goes with the return statement. Well, does your function get the input, do math, and then, yeah, I know, input, do math, and then get the output, right? Or maybe your function, just one function gets the input, and then it returns the input back to another function that does the math, and then it takes the result of that math and returns it to another function that puts it back to the output. So I guess the key takeaway right now, you know, is that a function can return a value, doesn't have to. It can work however you create it. So I guess if there's the con would be the learning curve, because you have to learn how these things work. The pro is that they're pretty flexible in how you can write them. In this case here, this function has parameters, so the values get passed into the parameters via the arguments. It then creates a variable to add those parameters together. Has another variable that divides them by 3, and then returns that result to, where does it return it to? Wherever you called that function. That's where it returns it to. Well, that's an exercise in this chapter, I think. Make a calculator.
Make a calculator.
Make a calculator, yeah.
I can't even calculate.
So another concept is variable scope. And here's an idea here, okay? For the 7th time, what's this variable called? What's the name of it? It's a parameter, right? And so the age scope is, I'll say this, the age parameter is visible only inside of this function. So right now, we're still in the script, but if I were to try to set age equal to 40, this is said to be out of scope, meaning it wouldn't work. Okay, so this age variable exists from this opening curly brace to the closing curly brace. If you try and reference it outside of this function, it's out of scope. So that's a parameter. Now if I have another variable, var, let's just say I create a variable for your gender here. Okay? This is a normal variable, but it's declared inside of a function. So here's another name, because you guys know parameters, you know what arguments are. Here's another name for a type of variable. Okay? A variable declared inside of a function is also known as a local variable. Okay? A local variable works just like its parameter, just like a parameter. It exists and can be accessed from wherever it's declared to the end of the function. Okay, now notice I say wherever it's declared. If I try and access it above, right here, that would not work. Okay, so from wherever it's declared and beneath, we could say gender equals male or whatever, and this would work. This is considered to be in scope. However, this is a local variable. If you work with it outside of the function, that's out of scope. Okay? So parameters and local variables are very similar. If I declare a variable here, var number, this is said to be a global variable. Okay, now you can access this global variable anywhere in your JavaScript, okay, including other scripts, including external scripts, okay, anywhere in the JavaScript you can access this variable, okay, so global variables are just that, global across the script, okay, so realize age, parameter, var, gender, so a variable inside of a function, this is called a local variable, and its scope is just like a parameter. Here's something we haven't said yet, but it's possible. If you leave off the keyword var and just say gender equals male, this would work if you leave off the keyword var, but it's bad practice. Okay, don't do this, because what this actually does is it creates a global variable that's declared inside of a function, and that creates very hard to troubleshoot JavaScript. Okay, because you're looking for a global variable, you're typically not looking for them inside of functions. They need to be declared outside of a function. So if you leave the keyword var off, this is bad. Okay, if you declare a variable inside of a function, make sure just put the keyword var on it. Okay. Then see that right there? Good programming technique. Programming technique bad there. So blah blah blah. They explain that on slide 17. This is kind of interesting. And this, I won't type this one out since it's already on the screen. This is a demonstration of global variables and local variables. So if we follow this script, we've got, what type of variable is this top one? It's global. And then this is a function declaration. We declare a function. What's this variable inside of the function? Local. So when we do a document.write color,
Which one was it called?
well, you see right here. Value printed is purple, which is what?
Local.
That's
Inside
your
of the
local.
function.
So when you're inside of the function,
That's higher than the global one?
well, when you're in the function, it's working with the local variable instead of the global. Now look at it down here, okay? So we call the duplicate variable names. This function runs. It prints out purple. But now let's look at the next line of JavaScript, document.write color. And in this instance, we're not inside of the function. It prints out green, which is the value of the global variable.
So whenever the function is called,
It works.
interprets for the global, local, and then
Yep.
when it's not.
That's if you have variables by the same name. If you can avoid having global variables and local variables by the same name, that's probably the better preference. Okay, that's a little bit more clear in a lot of cases. However, what we have here is we have two variables by the same name, and so one has to override the other in each situation. When you're in the function, it's going to use the local variable. When you're out of the function, it uses the global. I demonstrated one of these functions. There are a lot of built-in JavaScript functions, and we're just going to use these throughout the course. Right now, the only function I used was a ParseInt function, which took a number that was stored as a string and it made it a number that we could do math on. Okay, one thing, and I want everyone to think about this. If there's one thing you get out of this lecture, okay, put this in your brain. Okay, remember it. I'll quiz you on it on Monday. How about that? You cannot do math on strings. You cannot do math on strings. So remember that. That's why we tried to do math on a string and it didn't work. It concatenated is what happened there, right? It added strings together instead of doing math. So what we do is we take that string and we parse it into a number, like a ParseInt or a parsefloat. The difference between ParseInt and parsefloat, anyone know? What a difference between ParseInt and parsefloat? Or literally, what's the difference between an int and a float? An integer is a whole number. A float can have decimal places. Okay, so if your numbers have decimal places, you need to parse float. If it's a whole number, you parse int.
So is there any reason why you use int instead of float?
Well, if you know it's gonna be a whole number.
What if you don't know?
Parse float's safer. Parse float
Well,
would be.
usually parse float, I'll answer your ParseInt. I just use parse float for like a reason why that-
I don't make JavaScript. That's a good question. I don't know. You know, maybe ParseInt. I don't know.
If you
I'm not gonna
use
guess.
whole numbers, maybe.
Oh, you know what? Think of this. What if you have a decimal place number and you don't want the decimal places? ParseInt would truncate or chop off the decimal
So
places.
if it was like 8.2, it would just make it 8.
It'd just make it 8. 8.9 would just be 8. 9.4 would just be 9. So that'd be a scenario where you don't need the decimal places and you could chop them off. Like, I don't really care that you're 21 0.5. I just want your 21. You know. This talks about data types a little bit. You know, we just got done talking about what's the difference between an integer and a float. Both of those are considered to be numbers, you know, under the number category. So it's kind of weird, but JavaScript doesn't have an integer data type. The data type is just number. It doesn't have a float data type. It just has a number data type. There's a Boolean data type, a string, and there's undefined and null. Okay, null is like an empty value, meaning there's literally nothing stored there. The void. It's an undefined variable is different though. Undefined is different than null.
All I heard was a lot of numbers to that.
So realizing null is different than undefined. If you have a variable that never gets a value, it's said to be undefined. So here's an example. We have a variable called state tax. It never has received a value. And then we put it in a document.write statement. You can see it prints out undefined here. If we change the state tax to equal to 40, then it'll print out 40. We can then change it to be null. It'll print out null. So those are all different values for a variable. And you could test your variables against null and undefined or see if it has, a value. Important thing to remember, another important thing to remember is JavaScript is considered a loosely typed language. That's why a lot of people recommend JavaScript as a first language to learn. Okay, it's a little bit less strict than a language like Java or like C#. Okay, it's a little bit more flexible. Okay, now that doesn't mean it's as flexible as HTML. I mean, HTML has to be the most flexible language that exists. I mean, if you forget to close something, if you can write all sorts of bad HTML, it doesn't validate, yet the output of the screen is still somehow exactly what you wanted. You know, it's a nice and easygoing language. JavaScript is definitely not that way. I would say it'd go HTML is the most flexible. CSS, most of the time, if you write it wrong, it's not going to work. But you could still work out. Your CSS might not validate, and it could still work out. The JavaScript then is a notch up from that, and then Java would be a notch up from that. So it's considered a loosely typed language. What that really means is that when you declare variables, you don't have to declare data types for your variables. You just say var. Okay? But in Java, you have data types, and they have to have like an integer or a float or a bool for your data type. And here's an example of having a variable, and that variable stores all these different types of data, right? It can store a string, it can store a number, it can store a floating point number, it can store a Boolean, it can store null, and all those are valid. Okay, we did already talk about the difference between integers and floating point numbers. Booleans are true or false. So those are the two types of values that a bool can store. Here's an example of using a Boolean. And there's a whole lot of working with strings. So I think this is where I'm going to stop this particular lecture, and we'll pick it up with the next video. So we're right at an hour here, so it's a good stopping point. So we'll see everyone in the next video.